The email came on a Tuesday morning in February when the roads outside my apartment in Halifax were still grey with packed snow, and I was on my second coffee, not yet fully awake. It was from a law office in Ottawa. The subject line said, Estate of Gerald Whitmore. Urgent matter requiring your attention. I almost deleted it. I get spam that looks exactly like that. But something made me pause. The name. Gerald Whitmore, my mother's uncle. A man I had met exactly 4 times in my entire life. The last time being at a funeral when I was maybe 12. He had pressed a $20 bill into my hand and told me to buy myself something nice. And I remember thinking he had the saddest eyes I had ever seen on a person. I read the email 3 times standing in my kitchen in my socks. Gerald had died 6 weeks earlier, quietly, in a care home in Kannada. He had no children, no spouse. He had built a small construction company in the 70s and 80s, sold it in 2004, and apparently lived on almost nothing for the 2 decades that followed. The lawyer was writing to inform me that I was named as the primary beneficiary of his estate. The number at the bottom of that email, I won't say it exactly, but it had more digits than I had ever seen attached to my name. Just over $800,000 after taxes, after the estate was settled. My coffee went cold. I stood there for a long time. The first thing I felt was not joy. It was something closer to vertigo. I was 31 years old and working as a dental hygienist at a clinic in Dartmouth. I made decent money, enough to cover my rent, my car payments, my student loans, and still put a little away each month. I was not struggling. But I was also not someone who ever imagined owning a home in Halifax. Not at these prices, not on my salary, not without a partner splitting the mortgage. The idea of financial security, real security, the kind where you stop doing the math in your head every time you check out at the grocery store, had always felt like something that happened to other people. And now, here it was, sitting in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. I called the lawyer back that afternoon. His name was Mr. Hennessy, and he was kind and very thorough. He explained the process, the timeline, what I would need to sign. He also told me something that Gerald had apparently written in a letter accompanying the will. He said Gerald had always regretted losing touch with my mother's side of the family, that he had watched from a distance and felt I seemed, in his words, like someone who would do something sensible with it. I cried in my car after that call, not because of the money, because a man I barely knew had seen something in me worth trusting. I told no one. That decision came to me before I had even hung up the phone, almost instinctively, like something I already knew without having to think it through. I had watched enough happen in my family over the years to understand, deep in my gut, what that kind of news does to people. How it shifts things, how it changes the way someone looks at you, even if they love you. My family is not cruel. I want to be clear about that. My parents divorced when I was 9, and both of them remarried. And the extended mess of step-siblings and half relationships and old resentments had always resentment holidays feel like navigating a minefield in dress shoes. Nobody was a villain, but nobody was uncomplicated either. My older brother, Ryan, was 36 and had been asking me to co-sign a loan for his landscaping business for the better part of 2 years. Every time I explained I couldn't afford the risk, he would go quiet in that way. He had. Not angry exactly, just disappointed, like I had failed some test of loyalty I hadn't agreed to take. My mother's sister, my Aunt Diane, had borrowed $4,000 from me 2 summers ago when her air conditioning broke down and her line of credit was maxed. She had promised to pay me back by Christmas. It was now February, 14 months later, and she had not mentioned it once. My stepmother, Corinne, my dad's wife, had been pushing me for 3 years to invest in her friend's wellness company. You'd double your money, she kept saying. It's a sure thing. I had looked up the company once. It had 1 Google review and a website that hadn't been updated since 2019. And my dad himself. I loved him, I did. But he had a way of making every conversation about money feel like a negotiation. He had worked hard his whole life and had very little to show for it, and I think that had made him both proud and a little bitter in equal measure. So, no, I did not tell anyone. I hired a fee only financial planner in Halifax, a quiet, methodical woman named Dr. Arsino, who came recommended by a colleague at my dental clinic. She helped me set up a holding structure, talked me through RRSPs, TFSAs, real estate as an investment versus residence. She was serious and direct and did not make me feel stupid for knowing nothing. Over 3 meetings, we built a plan together, and it felt like the most adult thing I had ever done in my life. I started looking at houses quietly on my own, on my days off, not telling anyone where I was going, just driving to open houses in the north end of Halifax with a coffee in my hand, walking through other people's spaces, trying to imagine my life inside them. It was strange that time. I felt simultaneously the most free I had ever been and the most alone. I had something enormous happening inside me and no one to tell. I would lie awake at night and think about calling my best friend Jess and just saying it, just letting it out. But every time I got close, something stopped me. I wasn't ready. I didn't trust what would change. The test was not something I planned, it grew out of something real. In early April, my brother called me. He needed money, again, though this time the framing was different. His truck had broken down, he said. The repair was going to cost 3,200. He'd already called around for quotes. He couldn't do the job without the truck. Could I lend him something, even half? He'd pay me back by August, he promised. I knew that truck. It was a 2019 Ram 1500 with the extended cab. He had bought it new. It was a beautiful truck. I had seen him driving it just 2 weeks before at Easter dinner, and it had seemed fine to me. I told him I was sorry, but I was going through something right now, financially. My hours at the clinic had been cut, I said. Benefits review, temporary restructure. I was worried about my own rent. There was a long pause. Seriously, he said. Yeah, I said. It's been stressful. Another pause. Then, okay, I'll figure it out. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't say he was sorry to hear that. He just hung up about 40 seconds later. I sat with that for a few days. Then I started thinking, what if I did the same thing with everyone else? Not to be cruel, not to catch them in something. Just to understand, finally, clearly what I was actually working with, because I had spent so much of my adult life giving people the benefit of the doubt, assuming the best, staying quiet, swallowing my own resentment, and I was tired of it. I called my Aunt Diane next. I told her the same story, slightly adjusted. I said my clinic was cutting hours, I was looking at my finances, and I hated to bring this up, but I was wondering if there was any chance she could start repaying what she owed me. Even a little, whatever she could manage. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Oh, sweetheart, she said. I'm so sorry, that's really hard. The thing is, God and I just had to replace both her cars because the lease was ending, and honestly, the timing is just terrible for us. You know how it is. Both cars, on a lease. The timing was terrible. Of course, I said. Don't worry about it. You're sure? You'll be okay? I'll figure something out. You're so resilient, she told me. You always have been. I thanked her and got off the phone and just sat there in my kitchen looking at the wall. I called my stepmother Karen 3 days later. I told her I was going through a rough patch, that I was a little scared, honestly, and that I was reaching out to people I trusted. Karen is not a bad person. I truly believe that. But the first thing she said was, oh, this might actually be the right time to look at that investment opportunity I mentioned. If you put in what you have now, even in a down period, you'd be positioned to. Karen, I said, I'm telling you, I'm struggling. I know, I'm just saying this could help. She pivoted to sympathy after that, but the damage was done. I had heard the first impulse. That was enough. My dad was the last one I called. I had been putting it off. He answered on the second ring and immediately sounded rushed, which was normal for him. I told him the same story. Cut hours. Worried about rent. The word scared came out of my mouth, and I felt a small jolt of something because I hadn't planned to say it, and it was more honest than I intended. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you looked at getting a second job, even just weekends? There's good money in delivery driving right now." That was it. That was his response. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Do you need anything from me?" Just a practical suggestion that gently implied I should go figure it out myself. To be fair, he did say, near the end of the call, "Let me know if things get really bad." I said I would. I thanked him. We talked for another 3 minutes about nothing and hung up. I drove to Lawrencetown Beach that evening alone and walked along the sand in the cold for a long time. The water was dark and the wind was coming in hard off the Atlantic, and I thought about Gerald, who had left me everything without asking anything of me, who had trusted me without conditions. And then there was my great aunt Helen. Helen was my grandmother's sister. She was 78 years old and lived alone in a small bungalow in Truro, about an hour and a half outside Halifax. She had been a school teacher for most of her working life and then retired and stayed on in Truro because she said she liked the pace of it. I called her every few weeks, usually on Sunday mornings. She was sharp and funny and completely unsentimental in the best way. I had not called Helen as part of the test. I called her because I needed to hear a voice that had nothing to do with any of it. But somewhere in the middle of the call, I don't even remember exactly how it came up, I said something vague about things being hard right now. That I was a bit worried. And without asking for details, without asking for documentation or time to think it over, Helen said, "How much do you need?" I told her not to do that. "How much?" she said again, simply. I said something small would help, just to cover rent for a month while I sorted things out. "I'll e-transfer you to $500 tonight," she said. "You can pay me back whenever. Or don't. It doesn't matter." I told her absolutely not. "You're not going to stalk me," she said. "You've always been the one who shows up. Someone ought to show up for you." I cried on the phone with her. I hadn't cried in weeks. Not through any of it. Not through the calls with my brother or my aunt or my dad. Not through the real estate walks or the meetings with the financial planner. But something about that simple sentence unlocked something in me that I hadn't realized I'd been holding shut. Someone ought to show up for you. I didn't let her send the money, but I stayed on the phone with her for almost 2 hours that night. She told me about her own life, some things I had never heard before. Lean years she had gotten through, decisions she had made alone that had turned out right. She didn't give me advice. She just talked to me like I was a person worth talking to. I drove to Truro the following Saturday with flowers and a bottle of wine. I found the house in June. It was a semi-detached in the north end, older, with original hardwood floors and a small backyard that backed onto a community garden. It needed some work. The kitchen was outdated and one of the upstairs bathrooms had clearly been renovated by someone with questionable taste in the 90s. But the bones were good, and the light in the front room in the evening was extraordinary. I bought it. It took about 3 months from offer to close. I paid cash, not the full amount. That would have left me too exposed, but enough that the mortgage was small and the monthly payment was lower than my old rent. Dr. Arsenault had walked me through the math 6 different ways until I was sure. I told no one about the house until I had the keys in my hand. The first person I told was Helen. I drove to Truro with a bottle of Riesling. She preferred white. And we sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. The email in February, the meetings with the lawyer, the financial planner, the test I had run, if you could call it that, the house. She listened without interrupting, which is something very few people in my life know how to do. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said, "Good, that sounds exactly right." Then she asked to see pictures of the kitchen because she said if it was bad enough, she might have some old cabinets from a renovation she'd been meaning to deal with. That summer, I had 2 conversations that were not easy. The first was with my brother. I invited him to the house for dinner, just the two of us, and I told him I needed to say some things. I told him about the inheritance. I watched his face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, confusion, something that looked briefly like hurt, and then something harder underneath it. I told him about the call in April, about what he had not asked. He said, "I didn't know you were testing me." "I know," I said. "That's the point." He was quiet for a while. Then he said the truck had not actually broken down. He had needed money for a business decision he hadn't wanted to admit to, and the truck story had seemed easier. I didn't say what I could have said to that. I just let it sit there between us. I told him I was not going to co-sign his loan. I told him I would not be lending him money anymore, not because I didn't love him, but because I had been quietly lending and not being repaid for years, and it was not good for either of us. I said that if he wanted to come to dinner sometimes or call just to talk, I was here for that. He left before dessert. He texted me 2 days later and said he needed time to process things. I said okay. The second conversation was with my Aunt Diane. It was shorter. I simply told her that I wouldn't be forgetting the money she owed me, but that I also wouldn't be chasing it. I said I hoped she and God were well. She sounded uncomfortable and apologetic, and mentioned the cars again. I said I understood. I did not particularly understand, but I was tired of explaining myself to people who had already made their decisions. I took a week off in September and drove out to Cape Breton by myself. I stayed in a small cabin near Ingonish and walked the Cabot Trail in pieces and ate seafood every night and read 3 books I had been meaning to get to for years. On the last night, sitting on the deck with a glass of wine, watching the light go off the water, I thought about Gerald again. This man I had barely known, who had quietly accumulated something over a lifetime and then decided without drama to pass it to someone he believed would honor it. I hoped I was honoring it. The house was good. It was filling up slowly. A new couch here, plants in the window, a proper coffee setup on the kitchen counter. The spare room was just a spare room for now, but I had started thinking about what to do with it. There was a woman in my neighborhood, an older woman named Rose, who had mentioned offhandedly that she sometimes found the winters lonely since her husband passed. I had been thinking about that, about what it means to show up for someone, not out of obligation, not because of what you might need from them someday. Just because someone in your life once said, "I'll e-transfer you $2,500 tonight without missing a beat," and you learned something from it that you were still figuring out how to carry forward. My phone buzzed. It was Helen, sending me a photo of a cabinet she had found in her garage with the message "Solid Maple." "Your call." I laughed out loud into the dark. I typed back, "Save it for me. I'll come get it in October." And for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time I could remember, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I think about Gerald a lot still. A man who lived quietly, asked for nothing, and decided without any ceremony that I was worth trusting. He never explained why. He never asked me to prove it. He just made a decision about my character and acted on it, and then he was gone before I even had a chance to say thank you. There's something in that which I've been trying to understand ever since. What I know now, looking back at everything that happened in that year, is that the money was almost beside the point. What it did was create a set of conditions where people had to make a choice, a real one, not the comfortable kind. And those choices told me something I think I'd already suspected, but hadn't wanted to see clearly. My brother didn't lie to me about the truck because he's a bad person. My Aunt Diane didn't dodge the repayment because she is cruel. They did what they did because it was easy, because I had always made it easy, because I had spent years quietly absorbing small disappointments without naming them. I had trained the people around me to expect that from me. That's not entirely their fault. It's not entirely mine either. But I had to reckon with my own part in it. The decision to handle things quietly, to go to a financial planner, to read carefully, to think before acting, that came from somewhere in me that I hadn't fully trusted before. I had always second-guessed my own judgment in ways I wouldn't have admitted out loud. But sitting with that much responsibility, with no one to defer to, I found out I was actually capable of thinking clearly. That was its own kind of inheritance. Gerald gave me the money, but the process of managing it alone gave me back something I'd been quietly doubting about myself for a long time. And then there was Helen, 78 years old, living alone in Truro. No hesitation. I'll transfer you two to $500 tonight. She didn't calculate what she might get in return. She didn't weigh it against her own circumstances. She just responded to another person's need with everything she had available. That's not a small thing. That's actually one of the harder things a person can do, to give freely, without conditions, without keeping score. I try to carry that forward now. I'm not always good at it. But I think about Rose down the street, and I think about what it costs nothing to knock on a door and check in. I think about how Helen didn't set out to teach me anything. She was just being herself, and how that turned out to be the most instructive thing anyone did for me that year. The people who show up when it costs them something, those are the ones worth building a life around. That sounds simple when you write it down. It took me 31 years and a letter from a lawyer to understand it in my bones.